Well, hi everybody. It's Hoodie back with John Larder again for a much-awaited Club Grubbery episode. John, great to see you back on.
Thanks, Hoodie. Great to be back, and it's a really great interview today.
It is a big one, and you can tell it's a big one because we're wearing our ties. I was going to put a bow tie on David Martin, but I didn't want to. I didn't want you to think I was what we call in Australia taking the Mickey out of you. But
Yeah, well, Kim would say taking the piss, but yes, we
that's
understand.
right. That's right. So look, it's great to have you on. A lot of people have been saying, when can you get David Martin on? And well, here you are. And I think it's really timely that we've got you on the day after two monumental things happened with health in America with the Trump inauguration. First, you have US pulling out of the WHO. How good is that? And secondly, and coincident with that, was Biden's um, pardon. Now, why do you pardon somebody unless they've committed a crime? He pardoned Anthony Fauci.
Yeah, what a brilliant move.
So tell it, look, before we go into everything else and unpack your background and everything, tell us how that feels for you and what that looks like for you.
Well, it's been funny. I've been on a lot of interviews in the last 24 hours about this, and I keep telling people this is a day to celebrate because Biden made a terrible tactical mistake in the big long march to justice in this topic. Under Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of our Constitution, the president has the right to issue pardons, but there's an exception to what can be pardoned, and the exception is you cannot pardon an impeachable offense. Tiny little detail that nobody bothers to read. I mean, they read the Constitution Cliff Notes that they get on Wikipedia, but they don't actually read the Constitution, because if they did, they'd find out that it turns out that under the Edmund ruling in the Supreme Court, Edmund v. U.S., principal officers of federal agencies are subject to impeachment not only during their employment, but during their retirement as well. So the great thing is this particular pardon has no bearing on an impeachable offense. And the Senate today, if it wanted to, could institute articles of impeachment against Anthony Fauci, for which he would actually ultimately be liable. And why would that be important? Well, it'd be important because on 5 occasions, he has perjured himself in front of Congress, where he has said he did not do gain-of-function research, despite the fact that in October of 2014, in a letter written from NIAID to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he specifically says Ralph Barick's work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. Listen to what I just said. 2014, the work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1. Does that cause anybody a little tiny tadpole of concern that in 2014 he was weaponizing the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1 by name in 2014? And it was so egregious that not only did he have to send a waiver letter to UNC Chapel Hill saying you can keep doing the gain-of-function research, he added that you could do it in vivo, meaning you could put it in living systems. And he did one extra little detail, which is he acknowledged that it was in violation of the gain-of-function moratorium. What makes all of this helpful is that the pardon that Joe Biden gave him is effective June of 2014. There are some people that say it could go to January of 2014, depending on what you read. But the great news is Ralph Barick and that project and NIAID's funding for the project started, are you ready for this? In 2013, which means the crime that led to the terrorism that led to the world shutting down is not subject to the pardon. So whether we go down the pathway of the impeachable offense argument with the United States Senate, whether we go down the pathway of the racketeering leading to domestic terrorism, leading to global murder, the fact of the matter is this pardon is an admission of guilt of a crime according to the Burdick principle laid down in 1915. It's an admission of the guilt for the crime. Its acceptance is tantamount to, are you ready for this? The admission and acceptance of a confession. That's what it actually says in the Burdick ruling in 1915. So the great news is this is a terrible day to be Bill Gates. This is a terrible day to be Jeremy Farrar at the Wellcome Trust. This is a terrible day to be part of the CDC Foundation or the illegal foundations that run around the CDC or World Health Organization or any of these others. It's a terrible day to be part of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board at the World Health Organization, which is a racketeering criminal conspirator group that's been in place since the 1950s for the sole purpose of weaponizing nature against humanity. It's a bad day for all of them because now we've got an admission of guilt of the senior board member and orchestrator of this global terror campaign. So, does Dave Martin feel like this is a tough day to be alive? Heck no. We got more weapons in our arsenal in the last 24 hours than we had in the last 4 years.
Before we go any further into this, we're going to unpack your story a little to back up the foundation underneath underscoring what you're saying. But I want to say this to our audience. The material you'll be presented with today is compelling, and it will be very troubling to you. And some of you are aware of David Martin's presentations. I just watched his presentation to the European Union, and it's staggering. But we all need to take this into perspective, because if we go applying these things and running off half-cocked, we can get into all kinds of trouble. So the definition of wisdom in this case is going to be knowledge and proper application of what you're learning.
That's exactly right.
I think.
And Graham, I'd like to add one more thing.
Yep.
Every single thing I say, I will give you the reference. Look it up.
Yeah.
Look it up. The date, the author, the case, the precedent. Look it up. Don't ever take a word I say literally. Go and look it up. Be an independent consumer of information. My job is to convey information. Your job is to go and verify it and then come to your conclusions, because that's empowering people. That's what freedom of speech is about. Freedom of speech is not being the loudest voice in the room. You're exactly right, Graham. This is about taking the responsibility to get this information. This is not about beliefs. This is not about persuasion. This is about facts.
So what I want to say to you all is that I have looked at some of these references, and I find this information as compelling as it can be for me to make the following statement. After years in this fight, after trying to stay in our lane, after trying to make sure that we end mandates, that we keep our borders open, that we protect our children from being vaccinated against the will of their parents, that we want everyone to be reinstated to their former positions with full compensation, and we need a royal commission, or better still, a Nuremberg too, to uncover this. And I think it needs to even go far beyond that. I am convinced that we are dealing with a biological warfare incident. Absolutely. That has been staged and well managed for a long time. Now, I don't consider myself a nut job. I like to do risk-benefit analysis, but sometimes you've just got to identify the elephant in the room, and we can't keep skirting around it. So, David, we're going to hear some information from you today which will open a lot of minds. I think it's fair to say, John, that our program seems to strike a chord on the cusp of people who are waking up, because we try to keep it real, we try to keep it rational, and we try to keep the whole thing centered on what people can accept. And I think we're at a stage in our history now with what's happening in America that we can start calling this stuff for what it is. So, David Martin, first of all, unpack your story for us. How do you get to this position?
Well, a lot of people ask, when did you wake up, or when did you get the red pill, or whatever? And the answer is, for this troubles a lot of people, but as a teenager, I grew up hand milking cows on a Mennonite farm in Pennsylvania. So I know bullshit from a long way away, and I know the difference between truth and reality, because when you're at the business end of a cow at 4 o'clock in the morning, when your hands are freezing and it's minus 10 or minus 15 outside, you know what reality is and you know what shit is. And it's important to know the difference. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand that. But I come by this slightly through a very unusual path. And Graham, I'm going to, address another elephant in the room while we get on this. My mother's father was a very high society lawyer in Washington, D.C. His father was also very influential in Washington, D.C. In fact, his father was around back in the early part of the 1900s when a little organization called the Federal Reserve was being born. I actually have in my possession my great-grandfather's medallion, which was given to him for his role in helping establish a number of the federal agencies at the turn of the last century, so in the early 1900s. Ironically, both of them were Masons. In fact, very high in the organization. And ironically, because of choices my mother made about her faith, she decided to distance herself from her father and his tradition. And as a result of that, broke what was a long lineage of Masonic tradition in my family. It's fascinating when people look at the logo of my company, MCAM, and they go, oh my gosh, it's a Masonic symbol. Well, the truth is, it isn't. In fact, it is inspired off of the imagery that the Masons actually used several hundred years ago to come up with some of their symbols. But if you look very carefully at the logo itself, what you find is that the logo is comprised of the binding angles of oxygen and hydrogen that are binding angles to create water. And the other angles on the logo are the logo angles of the combination of the way carbon and oxygen and hydrogen get together to make glucose. Our logo is, in fact, the map of the river of life and the water of life. And if you have a problem with it, I hate to break it to you, you have a problem with the God that created everything. That's your problem, not mine. Because he's the one that created the 121-degree binding angle, and he's the one that created everything else. So just get this straight. Every image can be corrupted. A lot of images are. Every word can be corrupted. A lot of words are. And what we're going to talk about over the next couple hours here is the corruption of language and the corruption of images and the corruption of public policy and the corruption of terms like vaccine and health and everything else. And the fact of the matter is, it's a perfect place to start. Because when I was actually a young man in the mid-1980s, I went down to Central America during the Iran-Contra conflict. And I worked on the border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And I worked very closely with refugees, and I worked very closely with trying to do investigations into what became what everyone knows as the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s. And it was during that period of time that a number of people in the United States government figured out that I had some very unique abilities to get into places and get out of places and make differences and find information and do all those kinds of things when I'm in those locations. Not surprisingly, the United States government and several other governments, including, by the way, the government of Australia, took advantage of my skills across the past 3 decades for a whole host of things. A lot of people don't know that I was actually part of the author of what was called the Australia Law Reform Commission. And I was working in Australia 2 decades ago, coming up with the legal reforms to actually modernize Australia into a commercial economy rather than only a mining economy. So I've been around Australia a long time, and I once upon a time was a friend, are you ready for this? A friend of real prime ministers who actually really cared about the country of Australia. I know that really happened. It's like talking about the dinosaurs. Once upon a time in a land far, far away, there were actually people who actually saw public service as an honest and honorable role. That day has long gone, but thankfully it's coming back. But the fact of the matter is, I spent a lot of time in Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne and other places where I was part of the Australia Law Reform Commission as part of my work for Australia. I also worked with the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat and worked with the development of a number of cross-border interests. And there's a little artifact, since you brought up this, that I just thought I'd show everybody. This artifact is actually quite important. Let's see if we can get really close on that. If you're not familiar with Farsi, most people aren't. This is actually the medallion that was given to me by the president of Iran. It's on a very particular day, March the 25th and 26th of 2005. Now, why is this particular plaque so stinking important for this conversation? Well, first of all, it's because in 2001, in September of 2001, when the United States government did its first effort to use a biological warfare agent against its civilian population in the form of anthrax, I was asked by Chuck Schumer and members of Congress to look at how we could bust that investigation open and figure out why it was that in May of 2001, prior to the September anthrax outbreaks, why the United States Army bought 300 million doses of ciprofloxacin from Bayer. Graham and John, I don't know if you know, but we didn't have a giant hide tanning summer that year. We weren't out shooting buffaloes and deer and exposing ourselves to hides, which is where you get toxins like anthrax. There was no great buffalo hunt of the summer of 2001. I don't know if you know that. I know you lived down under. You probably had a giant kangaroo hunt that year, but we did not have a giant buffalo or deer hunt or anything else. And we didn't need 300 million doses of ciprofloxacin, which is a drug that we had not used in the United States en masse for any reason whatsoever. But it turns out we did need it because we knew we were going to unleash a biological weapon in September. Now, I can tell you how unpopular I was when I pointed out that the reason why we were doing that was to justify what became known as the PrEP Act in the United States. And in 2005, when President Bush signed the PrEP Act, which is the whole thing where you get the adult version of the National Childhood Vaccine Protections for manufacturers of vaccines, the whole reason they got that liability protection was because they conducted a terror campaign in the form of anthrax to get the public to accept that biological weapons need to be countermeasured. That's why we did it. In 2002, because of the work that my company does on intellectual property and tangible assets, one of the reasons why I worked with the government of Australia, in 2002, we were alerted to the fact that the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill had filed a patent on what was called an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. That was 2002. John and Graham, I've got some bad news for you. That was the year before SARS 1.0. Now, I'm going to ask you a simple question. We've been through the human condition for, I don't know, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, 100,000 years, I don't know. How is it that the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill files a patent on an infectious replication defective clone that they targeted to hit human lung and epithelial cells of the lung and of the heart? Why is it that they patented it in 2002 and we had an outbreak in 2003? Now, are you willing to believe that that was just nature happening the way nature happens? That nature conveniently read a patent application and decided to mutate a gene so that it could become something that was patented the year before? If you really want to believe that, ladies and gentlemen, you have, I don't know, you have a swamp in the Northern Territory that you should go swimming in with some saltwater crocs and see how that works out for you. It's not a good idea to actually think that nature read a patent in 2002 and then made the thing in 2003. What makes it even more problematic is that in 2003, the CDC filed a patent on the Chinese genetic sequence of what they called SARS isolated from humans. And 1 day later, guys, 1 day later. And remember, this is once upon a time in a land far, far away. This was done with typewriters, not computers. We didn't have word processors. It's important to realize that the day after the CDC filed a patent on the gene sequence, a company that sits right next door to the FDA, Sequoia Pharmaceuticals, filed a patent on the vaccine for the thing that had been discovered 1 day earlier.
Oh, my goodness.
Guys, the reason why this is important is because I've been briefing this. I've been briefing this for years. And the reason why I brought this plaque into being is a lot of people have said, well, yeah, Dave, when did you really start knowing this? Well, it turns out I was in Tehran at the request of President Khatami for the Biologic Engineering Conference in Tehran. I was sent there as a special envoy by President Bush and by our law enforcement intelligence services. And I was sent there to both give a speech, but also to find out what other biological weapons programs were happening in the world. And guess what I heard about when I was there? I heard about United States bioweapons programs on, are you ready for this? Biohacking coronavirus, biowarfare enabling technology. Graham, we don't like to use the term biological weapon, and we don't like to use the term biological warfare because those are trigger words. And in the diversity and inclusion world that we live in, we don't want to use trigger words. But let's get really clear on the fact that the person who called this a biological weapon was Ralph Barrick, the guy who made the weapon. So the reason why we're calling it what it is And the reason why I'm calling the thing that happened in 2019 and 2020 a biological weapon is because the inventor of it himself called it that. Anthony Fauci called it that. And in 2019, when the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board on September 18th published their statement that said there was going to be an accidental or intentional release of a lethal respiratory pathogen, look it up, ladies and gentlemen. It's page 8 of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board document that was published by the World Health Organization September 18th, 2019. They said on page 8 there was going to be an accidental or intentional release of a lethal respiratory pathogen so that by September 2020, the world would accept a universal vaccine. And we're supposed to believe that a bat and a pangolin got drunk and walked into a bar in Wuhan and started making out and sneezing on people somewhere in the early weeks of December 2019 because they read that report and nature conveniently backed into a pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why I started this presentation by saying, I know which end of a cow to milk and I know what bullshit is. That's bullshit. And we need to call it what it is. The world knew it was doing this. They knew that they were going to create a campaign of terror, and they've done that now multiple times. And I have been in the United States for law enforcement and for the White House. I have been the inspector that has actually broken stories on edible vaccines, about biological threats, about ricin poisoning, about aerosolizing anthrax, about blast-resistant anthrax that can be weaponized in RPGs for crowd distribution. Do any of these things sound like public health? Do any of these sound like, people just trying to help out the health of people? A rocket-propelled grenade to disseminate a biological weapon, a patent held by the United States Army. Does that sound like public health to you? No, it doesn't. And it doesn't because it isn't. So to your point, we have to start calling it what it is.
John, I'll throw to you in a sec. What I want to do is pose the question to any of you who are looking at the material we're presenting for the first time. Perhaps you're new to this. Perhaps you're waking up and you smelled a rat in the cheese factory, and it's never too late, believe me. The basic question we've been asking politicians, media people, and bureaucrats alike is, if you thought that someone was tampering with your DNA or your immune system, would you like to know about it? It's a simple question. If you answer no to that, why are you saying no? It's like saying, I don't want to know if my house is on fire. So what we're presenting you with is information that will support our desire to have this thoroughly investigated by taking away the censorship, bringing back the people who've been banned in the last few years, people like David Martin, and let's get this thing sorted out once and for all. Johnny Larder.
Well, I think to put it into context that people might understand, I mean, this seems to me, David, like it's like getting the lotto numbers an hour before the balls drop.
Right.
These patents. I mean, in your opinion, how certain are you that these patents represent known technology?
Oh, absolutely. Because what we know is that not only do the patents contain the same material that are in the scientific publications and the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, but right after the alleged pandemic broke, as soon as the committee, which is called the ICTV, which is the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses, which is an arm of the World Health Organization, the minute the ICTV met, and by the way, people can go to our website, m-cam.com. They can download this. We published the hundreds of patents, John, hundreds, that had all of the sequences that the ICTV said was unique about SARS-CoV-2. These were already patented. There was nothing. Let me say this very clearly. There was nothing in the publication of the ICTV that was not already published in dozens of patents and not published also in tons of proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences. Now, listen, do I think sometimes nature throws us curveballs? Absolutely. Right? Sometimes we get weird storms. Sometimes we get rogue waves. Sometimes we get weird, Hoodie knows, weird wind shears that nobody saw coming, and there it was. I'm not saying nature can't throw you a curveball, but nature does not read patent applications. Never has.
And in relation to warp speed, I mean, clearly it was never warp speed. I mean, this has been a 20-year process.
Well, it's longer than that. I hate to break it to you. It was in 1966 that the United States and Britain started collaborating on sharing versions of coronavirus samples between U.S. and British subjects. That was 1966. 1967 was the first time we actually confirmed infection, where we took pathogens from one place and infected a population in another. So that's as old as me, 1967. And then it gets a little funny because in 1990, November of 1990, Pfizer filed the very first patent on a spike protein coronavirus vaccine. Spike protein coronavirus vaccine, November of 1990. I don't know what version of warp speed you're talking about, but that's like putting molasses outside at the top of, I don't know, one of the mountains in Victoria during the middle of a snowstorm and telling me how fast that's rolling down the snowbank. That's not warp speed. That's a snail trail on the best of days. So this patent that was filed November of 1990 by Pfizer was specifically for a spike protein vaccine. So are we sitting here pretending like warp speed happened? No, come on, let's get real. In November of 2019, according to Ralph Barrick's own written admission, and according to the information from Alex Azar, who was at the time the Secretary of Health and Human Services, according to both of them, the information that went into the production of what we called the vaccine for COVID was actually transferred from the Chinese and from UNC Chapel Hill in both January and November, respectively. Now, how is it that you could transfer the information for a vaccine from North Carolina to the Vaccine Research Center? How could you do it before the first patient ever came down with a disease? How do you do that?
Can you?
A rat in the cheese factory, John.
Well, that's what it is, Hoodie. It is. It's complete madness. I mean, so, I mean, I suppose, David, in terms that people will understand the Omicron and Delta, when were they really?
Well, listen, I don't know if you're familiar with PCR testing, but I give people the analogy that if you were to take a vacuum and you just, oh, sorry, I think Kim said that the official term in Australia is if you're going to hoover something, right? You're gonna go suck up the dust bunnies in your lounge room. If you went and you sucked up dust bunnies in your lounge room, there's a very high probability that in that sweeper you'd find some carpet. You'd probably find some fluff from your lounge. You'd probably find something that the dog or the cat drug in. You'd probably find a bunch of things. And if you told me, hey, guess what? I found a fiber. Go, great. What was it? Well, it was polyester. Okay, great. Where'd it come from? Well, the fragment that I'm looking at out of this vacuum cleaner bag, that fragment looks like it probably came from a carpet. But the carpet is the same color as the lounge. So is it the carpet or the lounge? Well, we don't know. The problem with a PCR is that's what it is. It's a dust bag filled with little dust bunnies. And so it turns out that if you want to look for something, if you do enough of what's called cycle time amplification, you can find anything from anything. What we had to do is we had to create the illusion that there was something different going on. So we create what's called phylogenetic trees. And you can go back and look this up. But it turns out that if you go back and say, well, what were the variants and how did the variants get around? It was not a function of people getting sick, because suddenly, mysteriously, the virus magically mutated everywhere and there was suddenly an Omicron variant. But ironically, there was no phylogenetic history that showed how it transmitted. It just got a memo one day to go change. And then it got a memo the next day to go change. Remember what the whole objective of this was. Had nothing to do with whether there was a variant or a variant or a variant. This is a mind control propaganda campaign specifically to make the public live in terror so that they would do what? And you guys know the answer.
Why?
The public would shut up, line up, and take the shot. That was the reason. And everyone was in on it, and everybody knows it. The reason why we have companies like Fours Marsh, the reason why you have entities all across Australia, marketing agencies and mainstream media outlets that suddenly had the same news at the same time with the same language, with the same number of case counts and the same number of anything else, not because there were facts behind any of this. Nobody was independently verifying any of these facts. If you were told that you need N95 respirator masks, then everybody needed them. If you were told that there were 37 cases today, everybody had 37 cases today. You can go across like the Operation Mockingbird videos, and you can see the number of places where the exact same number of cases, the exact same number of beds in hospitals, the exact same number of exposed patients, every one of them is the same. And you sit there going, no, come on, seriously, that can't be real. There's no such thing in nature. Nothing in nature happens orchestrated that way. That's a human fingerprint on a human manipulation of a human terror campaign that was orchestrated for a singular reason. And by the way, lest you think I'm hypothesizing this, Peter Daszak, Anthony Fauci, and Ralph Baric had the audacity in 2014 to say, to increase the public's understanding of the need for medical countermeasures, such as a pan-coronavirus vaccine, we need to have the media create hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. Let me go back to that last statement. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process. That statement was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And are you seriously going to believe today that a pathogen that was isolated from Wuhan in 2013, that was subject to gain of function during the gain of function moratorium as published in the 2016 Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that says WIV1 poised for human emergence? Are you seriously going to tell me that all of those things happen and then accidentally there was an outbreak in Wuhan when we have hundreds of documents that show that this was weaponized from Wuhan in 2013? It's nonsense.
It is absolutely crazy. And amidst all that terminology, Dave Martin, we have another terminology that's crept into this industrial murder: acceptable death rate. I mean, how offensive is that? Acceptable.
Listen, when Pfizer and Moderna published memos, which, by the way, if you go back to their SEC filings, and let's get really clear on this, in April of 2020, you go back to this SEC filings of Moderna, and both the SEC and the European Stock Exchange filings of BioNTech, which was the Pfizer arm of their manufacturing arm, both of them made the statement that this was an experimental gene therapy. Both of them said that. Now, it is illegal in the United States, and ironically, it's illegal in all of the Commonwealth to do what's called deceptive medical practice, which is when you use a terminology to get the public to accept a thing when you know the thing isn't what you're saying it is. That deception is illegal. But at the very same time that the SEC filings and the European Stock Exchange filings said that this was an experimental gene therapy, Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates and all the mainstream media said that this was a vaccine. Let's be abundantly clear. In 2020, in April of 2020, there was only one definition of a vaccine. And that definition was an agent that was actually designed to disrupt infection and transmission of a pathogen. This thing, in its clinical trials in every country on earth, did not even measure infection or transmission. It measured, allegedly, the severity of symptoms, meaning that it never was a vaccine, even by the legal definition of vaccine. It never was, It never has been. This has been deception, and it's been willful deception for the purpose of promoting an illegal agent, which is an experimental gene therapy, on the public. And it turns out that just 2 years ago, the CEOs of several companies started admitting it. They actually said on the record that if the public heard that it was an experimental gene therapy, they wouldn't even volunteer to take it. So they had to call it a vaccine. They've admitted to the crime. You know, Graham, you started this talking about a Royal Commission investigation, and I've been around a lot of Royal Commission investigations. Quite frankly, I think a lot of them are not worth the paperweight that the book that they ultimately come up with has anything to do with. I mean, look at what they did with Cardinal Pell. Look at what they've done with a lot of other Royal Commission is another way for calling it sweeping under the rug, which is good if you want to run the vacuum and get the pieces, to the example I gave before, but it is not actually helpful to get accountability. But the problem that we have in this particular case is that we actually have now the admission of crimes. This is an outright admission. You don't have to investigate a thing. There's no investigation. The investigation is, why did the public sector, why did your prime minister, why did the horrible criminal Dan Andrews, and I said that, the criminal Dan Andrews, and by the way, I've got a whole bunch of reasons to call him a criminal, so not just this, because Dan Andrews knows some stuff I know about defense procurement that would actually put him behind bars in any civilized country. So if Dan Andrews wants to take issue with me, he can bring it on, because I'd love to talk to him about his defense procurement of land vehicles, and I'd love to talk to him about his procurement of submarines. And if he really wants to go there, I'd love to have him come. Because the fact of the matter is, Dan Andrews, the criminal, who was more than happy to shut down Victoria and turn it into a despot torture state, that Dan Andrews knew that he was participating in a crime and didn't have any problem with it. So are we going to sit there and do a Royal Commission on, did Gates do it? Did Fauci do it? Did, the World Health Organization do it? No. We should be asking a very fundamental question. Why was the Australian government absolutely complicit?
Yep.
Absolutely complicit. And not only complicit, but why did the government of Victoria and why did the country of New Zealand serve as case examples of the suppression of civil liberties at the extreme? Why was it that we chose those locations to see how far the Commonwealth could be put on its knees? Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, the real Royal Commission should be asking those questions, because the facts of COVID are already known.
Yeah, we've been talking about COVID for 4 years, let's be honest, but there needs to be a very careful examination of who's pulling the strings. I mean, people are blaming Fauci, they're blaming Gates, but we know that these guys are only part the way up the tree.
That's exactly right.
Who do you think is at the top of the tree?
Well, listen, I did a whole presentation probably about 2 years ago now, where I called it the COVID privateers. These were all the companies and individuals who were responsible for the carnage that's happened. And there's no question that you have an enormous number of different organizations. I would encourage people to go find that online. There's tons of copies of it online, where I actually go through the contracts with individual organizations, where you have advertising agencies, global advertising agencies. You have organizations like Palantir, which is the data collection, data surveillance organization that's run by Peter Thiel, which, as you, giant shock, found out was collecting data on citizens and making sure that we had the ability to track digital identities and all kinds of other things. No different from SAIC in the last 2 decades, where you have companies across the board, and these are the pharmaceutical companies, these are finance companies like BlackRock, that actually are the financing entities that are profiteering on the back of this. There are tons and tons of organizations. There's no question that Gavi and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are right at the white hot core of this, but they too are being money laundering agencies for other people who are actually putting money into this terror campaign. Yes, there's the George Soroses of the world. Yes, there are the other actors, but the fact of the matter is, if you go and look at the COVID privateers presentation I made, I actually list them all. I list them by name. I list the companies, and they're all out there for everybody to look at. And if I knew you were going to ask a question, I'd pull the screen up, but I don't have the screen up. So I'll encourage people to go find it, because the COVID privateers is something you can find online.
Yeah, you do have the ability to share screen if you feel you need to during the interview. So go ahead and do that. So a lot there's if you look at things from a biblical perspective, you can see
Yep.
clearly that timelines are running out. We know that that's happening. We know that this is a battle between good and evil. There's no two ways about it. You can't sort of quantify it any other way. In your opinion, how much influence do secret societies have in this?
So a lot less than people want it to be. This is more insidious than secret societies. This is actually about a group of people. And I wrote a novel back in 2011 that a lot of people had a hard time with, where I pointed out that there was a group of people in the late 1990s who got together and decided that, not unlike the Bretton Woods Conference in the 1940s, which gave rise to things like the World Bank and the IFC and multilateral organizations like the UN and other things, a group of people got together and said, I bet we could actually take over the world. And all it would take is an absolute commitment to just amorality. And let me be really clear on what I mean by that. Not immorality. A lot of things they do are immoral, but amorality is genuinely not having any consideration for the consequence of actions. It's actually worse than immorality. Immorality, you actually at least know that there's a bad guy, but amoral people have no compass. They have no grounding. They have no principle. And if you look at most of these individuals, Graham and John, there's a unifying feature of almost all of them, and that is that almost all of them lost the child that they wished would be their heir. Now, I don't know anything about you guys' personal life, but let me share with you. I am thankfully the biological father of two beautiful children, and courtesy of inheriting Kim's daughter, I was able to have Dad 2.0. So I've had 3 kids that I've been able to raise. My kids, 2 older kids, are married. They are married and they're having kids. My son is expecting his second in February, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be a grandpa now 3 times over. I can tell you that every day of my life, I celebrate the beautiful children that I've seen grow into amazing adults. My kids are fabulous kids. They're amazing kids. And their kids are amazing. And I'm watching my children become great parents. So my heart is filled with this idea that I'm going to keep fighting for a better world, because I know that my kids are going to be fighting for a better world and their kids are going to be doing it, because we have morals and values that actually say that this is not our life. This is generational. This is a story about the ongoing nature of the blessing of family. If you asked me today, what would it be like to live in a world where you don't want your kids to make it? I can see how you could become amoral really fast.
Yeah.
I can see. And what I've encouraged people to do, because so many people are looking for the whodunit, who's the bad guy. Somewhere behind the curtain, there's the Wizard of Oz, and he's this nefarious actor. And I would love to stop and encourage people. You know, if you're a person of faith, and I don't know what your audience is, I don't know if, but what I'm going to say, I don't care whether you're a person of faith or not. What I'm going to tell you is that as long as there's breath, there's the possibility of redemption. And that's an absolute truth.
Yep.
I have never gotten to the point in my life where I've written off any human being as beyond the capacity for redemption.
Yep.
And I think we need to be really clear on the fact, and I've said this many times, that before we actually look at the plank in our brother's eye, we ought to look at the plank in our own eye. Because the fact of the matter is, how did this happen? How did we get here? I'll tell you how. We were more concerned with the AFL or the NRL,
yep,
or what was happening with our friends at the pub. We were more concerned about that than we were concerned about the fact that a government was being hijacked, and a government, I don't know, let's, for example, say a very large island continent country, I don't know, somewhere in the South Pacific, without mentioning any names, was watching as 80% of its economy was sold to another country. And as long as everybody felt okay with the fact that their house prices were going up, and everybody felt okay with the fact that there were plenty of ships that are moving goods and services back and forth, and everybody actually realized that according to PricewaterhouseCoopers in Sydney and in Melbourne, the economy of the service industries of Australia was going through the roof. As long as all that was happening, we didn't actually ask questions, did we? We didn't ask questions about, hey, is it a good idea for 80% of our economy to be dependent on a single trading partner that doesn't have our best interest in mind? Should we have been concerned when we didn't, as Australia, stop and say, hold on a minute, if China becomes the single largest shareholder of our country, is it possible that they may exert influence over, I don't know, our health policy, I don't know, our public policy, I don't know, all these other things? And you know, the tragedy is we are so prone to look for the error in someone else without looking in the mirror and saying, where were we complicit? Where were we apathetic? Where did we decide it was somebody else's problem to make sure that somebody's monitoring this? Where did we decide as a country? And why is it that a bow tie wearing Virginian was on an Australia Law Reform Commission? I mean, I might be a bright guy, but guess what? I should have had people from Australia that were kicking my butt from here to Kingdom Come on Australia law. And guess what? I actually had read more Australian law than the people on the Law Reform Commission in Australia.
Yep. And
that's because there were more people interested in what high school you went to, what college you went to, what prep school did you go to? Did you go to the right, Sydney this school or Melbourne that school or whatever else? And I'm sitting there going, people, wake up. There's a real thing called a global community that's actually going on around us. And we're still sitting there going, are we going for Collingwood? Are we going for, Melbourne? Are we going for the Swans? Are we going for and I'm just sitting there going, stop that. Now, I'm not saying, don't have your team. And I learned quite unfortunately that I didn't even know what the word barrack meant. And then I was asked who I barrack for. I don't even know. I don't even know what barracking is. But the fact of the matter is, we were all complicit in this. And that's the reason why I just encourage people. You said something really important, and Graham, I want to come back to this. There is a giant good and evil game playing out right now. But I got some really bad news for a lot of people. The reason why the New Testament has the parable of the sheep and the goats is because a lot of people who think they're sheep
are goats.
And I hate to break it to you, but I'll tell you what, the number of people who told me, oh, no, I was on the right side of things, and I woke up, and I red pilled, and I this, and I that, and I'm sitting there going, yep. And one day, there's going to be an accounting. And the question is going to be, where were you? Where were you?
Yep.
When the suffering happened? Did you hunker down? Did you keep your voice down? Did you make sure you didn't ruffle any feathers? Or did you do what Kim and I did, which is put our faces out in public?
Yep.
And man, did we get the slings and arrows.
John and I gave evidence in the Senate Estimates Committee hearing on the terms of reference for if we did have a Royal Commission, which we knew we were never going to have, and it was not going to be effective anyway. But I got to indicate, I used to teach human factors in the airline industry, and I got to say to the Senate that Australia has participated in the greatest human factors failure in global history.
That's correct.
We have totally allowed these things to go off on our watch. So what do we do with that? Do we just, all right, first of all, we've got a whole bunch of people who are dying because of it. We're losing relatives, we're losing friends, we're losing colleagues. Family members are dying. Families are breaking up because nobody agrees on the issues, because they're too scared to look at it. They're in denial, which is don't even know I am lying. They're in denial. And here we have this situation where we need a bunch of people who are allowed to practice their medical expertise in the right way to come out and start healing the injured and healing the infected and healing the wounded. We need a whole bunch of social experts who are trying to heal the chasms in our countries globally.
Yep.
And we need a whole bunch of ethical legal people and politicians who are going to take this head on to make sure this never happens again. And because we're too busy covering our asses, David Martin, none of this appears to be happening.
Correct.
What do we have to do to get this to happen?
Yeah, so let's deal with the most difficult Band-Aid to pull off. We as a society, globally, I'm not talking about America or Australia or anything else, I'm talking about the world. We are ill-equipped to handle grief at scale. We just don't have the skill set for it. You know, we kind of accept that a grandmother or a grandfather or, you know, somebody passes along from time to time. We kind of get that. But we don't understand that when Moderna and Pfizer created the mRNA injection, we don't understand that they included a thing called pseudouridine in that injection. In 2018, pseudouridine was published to be a pro-cancer agent. And by pro-cancer, what I mean is not only did it stimulate the body to activate cancer, but it did something else. It actually shut down the natural systems to turn cancer off. If the three of us croaked right now and we were all hauled into a morgue to do an autopsy, the great news is that all three of us would have cancer somewhere. Just the nature of the beast, nature of living, environmental issues, lifestyle issues, nutrition issues, we'd have it. The great news about the human body is that we have natural defenses against that. And so a lot of weird cells pop up, and the great news is the body has ability to respond and kill off the weird cells, and we go through our life, and the vast majority of us, in an unaltered state, will not die of cancer, will die of something else, probably something stupid in my case. I'll probably fall off of something or get hit in the head with a tree or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, we have a natural system in our body that actually responds to these abnormal cells. Well, here's a tiny little problem. The Pfizer and Moderna injections specifically targeted the system that controls that and turned it off, which is the reason why you hear the term turbo cancer, which until COVID didn't happen. There was no such thing as turbo cancer. People didn't discover cancer at stage 4. And I'm talking to a country that is rife with skin cancers and rife with a couple other GI cancers. So I know what I'm saying when I'm saying this to an Australian audience. There is a lot of risk around cancer. And the fact of the matter is the last thing you would want to do is inject a population that already has an abnormally high incidence of, let's just say, melanomas or other forms of skin cancer. You wouldn't want to inject that population with something that turns off cancer fighting capabilities. But in the case of Pfizer and Moderna, those things happen. And that was willfully done. The spike protein that was synthesized into both the mRNA sequence for Pfizer and Moderna both target the human heart. And it is not surprising that we see people all across the world now having myocarditis, now having congestive heart failure, now having acceleration of other cardiac problems. In fact, I don't know anybody who doesn't know somebody who has one of those heart conditions. It's as sure as waking up. You're going to find out that somebody's in the hospital with, congestive heart failure. They need to have a catheter because they've got a clot. These were things that were published and known. They knew that the formula that was being injected was going to cause these things. These were all published. Guys, in 2018, everything I said was published and known about what's going on in here. We knew that the propylene glycol that was being used as a stabilizing lipid agent, we knew that that was actually so toxic it was considered an industrially unsatisfied and unstable for human consumption molecule. And that was put in so that we could actually stabilize the shelf life of the injection. We knew that was going to create clots. We knew that was going to cause cancer in some people. We knew that was going to cause myocarditis in some people, and we didn't pay any attention. So I got bad news first. We haven't seen the wave of suffering yet. And that's a terrible thing to have to say to people, but it's true. And we have to address the fact that we are going to have more grief to come because of actions that were taken by blinding the public to the facts. Because if people had listened, and I talked about this at very, very early days, other people did, and you guys know how hard it was to even find my stuff online. You know that. It was next to impossible in the Commonwealth. They closed down every way that this information could get out. But now people can go back and look at my presentations in 2020 where I laid all this stuff out before shot number 1 was delivered. It was all public. Yep. And we paid no attention to it. So we're going to have, the first thing we're going to have to do is get really clear on the fact that our neighbors, once again, I'll use a biblical metaphor. The Good Samaritan story is going to come back and really bite us.
Yep.
Who is our neighbor? Well, I'll tell you what. Our neighbor is not just everybody who's suffering, but our neighbor is going to include people who ridiculed us.
Yep.
Our neighbor is going to include people who wished ill upon us.
Yep.
People who actually had the audacity to say, I wish the unvaccinated would die.
Yep. That's
going to be your neighbor. So if you're a person of ethical and moral consequence, you're going to have to go inside right now and go, oh, am I prepared to offer a cup of cold water to a person who wished me dead?
Yep. Beautiful.
And if you're not prepared to do it, examine your heart right now and get ready for it, because you need to be that person. If we want a better humanity at the other end of this, we have to make sure that we don't sit in judgment and go, well, I'm not going to help you because you actually, and then fill in all the judgment gaps that we had. So part 1, and that's why I wanted to start with what everybody can do. We can clean up our attitude and realize that even if we were ridiculed, and even if we were mocked, and even if we were put down, and even if we were threatened, our job is to remain and commit to being human with every single person that needs our help, because they will need it.
Yes.
That's number 1. Number 2 is we need to actually focus on the real point. And the real point is we had a public sector that was sold so that our public interest was not being served, but the interest of private sector considerations overwhelmed the public responsibility. And this is something we need to deal with at the election level. You guys are looking at the possibility of some elections coming up. I know the UK is having some elections coming up. You know, we've had too few people actually confront the individuals standing for election. Too few people are actually confronting them and saying, before you get my vote, you have to earn it. And you have to earn it by making written pledges to commit to ending this kind of tyranny. What does that mean? That means ending bribes from the People's Republic of China and Australia. That means stopping the influence of China manipulating the government of Australia by using financial incentives so that your real estate values are now so exorbitant that Asians can buy property that Australians can't even begin to touch. We need to actually be looking at real places where the real value of Australia is actually paramount in the minds of elected officials and not secondary to the financial interests that they serve.
Yep.
And you guys have a spring, or it's going into your fall, but you have coming up in April and May an opportunity to hold people accountable, and you need to hold them accountable. You need to actually share these videos. You need to be sharing you guys' previous content. You need to be actually being part of that solution. And then the third thing, and I hate to break it to you because I know coming from America, I always got in trouble when I said this, but the lucky country story has to end. Australia's not a lucky country. Australia is a country that is rich in resources. That's absolutely true. And it's rich in culture and heritage. That's actually true. All of those things are true. And quite frankly, having lived there, having been part of the Australian community for over 2 decades, I'm more than happy to say I'm very proud about all the Australian connections and roots I have. I love it. But I'm going to make a very, very clear statement. When you guys talk about your health service, you need to actually blow the thing up. Because what you don't understand in Australia, because it's easy for Australians to go, oh my gosh, go over to America, you have to buy your own insurance, and you have to this, and you have to that, and oh my gosh, it's so great because Australians, we can just walk into a doctor and get this, and we can walk into a pharmacy and get that. But what Australians don't understand is that consolidation of power, the absence of true competition, is the reason why you can line up kids at stadiums and inject them with a lethal toxin.
Yep.
and not have anybody who has the ability to stand up with ethics and say, I'm not going to participate. So what happens is that you build this social system, which is sold to you as the bill of goods, that this is a great system. It's a great healthcare system. It's, it's free healthcare. It's this. Ladies and gentlemen, I hate to break this to you. This is probably the hardest piece of news for any Australian to hear. Your healthcare system isn't free. You are enslaved by the illusion of its freedom. You don't have choice. You don't have the ability to make independent decisions. And I can guarantee you that your physicians are actually the front for drug dealing corporations that have more interest in what you take as pills than whether or not the quality of your life is adequate. And it sucks to have to say that. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that America has it any better. We wouldn't know healthcare if it bit us in the ass. But the fact of the matter is, this kind of lucky country syndrome that says, oh, we have this value and we have this merit and we have all this kind of stuff. Stop that story, because that story drowns out the honest criticism and the honest accountability of the national health system that should be criticized, and it should be scrutinized, and your medical professionals should be held to account. But because it's the lucky country and because you have free health care, no one bothers to ask free at what cost. No one asks the question, and we have to.
That's an inconvenient truth for a great many Australians. It's one I came to terms with a long time ago. And most people will say, oh, you've got a nice home or whatever, you're very lucky. No, the harder you work, the luckier you get. And Australia keeps saying we're the lucky country, and we've allowed that to dull us down into an...
That's exactly right.
We are the most apathetic bunch of losers. I hate to say this. We just hold ourselves up really, really high. But when push comes to shove, nowadays... In the past, you couldn't say that. We were toe-to-toe with every war that America participated in, and we were right there at the front line.
Yep.
But we would struggle today in this country to mount any kind of defence that you could rely on. We couldn't do it because we become too apathetic.
Well, and listen, I have dear friends who are members of the military in Australia, and I honor the service that they've done, like I honor the service that all of those here have done and all those in our allies around the world. But what I would say is that I watched the veterans of Australia coming back from conflicts like what happened in Rwanda. Dear friend, that his life will never be the same because what he had on his peacekeeping mission. I've seen guys coming back from Afghanistan, and I've seen what they've gone through. And if Australia was dead serious, they wouldn't just wear a poppy once a year. They'd actually care about the emotional and mental state of those individuals. They would care about the fact that when Australia deploys, they shoot their soldiers full of experimental drugs and what they call vaccines, which are clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies that people in Australia don't even know is being done. They don't even know. So to your point, Graham, yeah, there's so much that is the information side of this thing, which we have to build and we have to work on, because the complacency has led to a place of apathy. And now when a person like me, I moved to Australia in 2016. And I moved to Sydney, and then a year later, Kim and I moved to Melbourne. Do you realize that virtually every meeting I went to, whether it was in business or politics, I was asked, why on earth would you come to Australia? Nobody comes to Australia. Successful people leave Australia. Well, that's a horrible thing to find out. It's a horrible thing to see. But the tragedy is, whether you're talking about your, Home and Away, or whatever your soap opera thing is, or, if you succeed, what do? You leave. You go to Hollywood. If you succeed, you leave. If you're in business, you succeed, you leave. If you're working for any of the major, accounting firms or legal firms or any of the big banks, what is success? The success is you leave, right? What does that mean? What it means is that the soul of Australia is getting poorer because the apathy is mounting. And that's exactly what we have to turn around. Yeah. Because there's great Australians doing great things. And I've met tons of them all across this country. I know that when I was an expert in residence for WA, and I know most Australians go, WA, where's that? I mean, I swear, I think I know more of Australia than most Australians know. But when I was out in places like Kalgoorlie and I was out at places that are out in the middle of the desert in WA, I saw real Australians working really hard to make an amazing future for the country. But I also saw that every single time anybody tried to raise their hand and go, hey, I think there's a better way, maybe we should think about that. The tall poppy syndrome in Australia is absolutely alive and well. And the minute somebody raised their hand and said, I think that's wrong, I think we could do it better, I think there'd be a better way, man, you might as well just get lined up for a firing squad, because that's what's going to happen. And that's why we have to have, I mean, listen, you guys know this probably. I was on with Pete Evans early in the pandemic, and he got crucified for talking to me.
Yeah.
Now, Pete Evans has done a bunch of things, and, you know, people have their opinion on him, whatever. I don't care. But what he was trying to do is he was trying to bring information to Australia through the only portal he had. Good on him. Well done. And he got crucified for having me on his show.
Yeah.
I think Pete's a fabulous guy. You know what? I know people like him all over the world, and they're interesting people. And yeah, maybe they have some quirky views on one thing or another, but I'll tell you what, he did what he could do to promote a message that no one else was doing, and good on him for doing it.
He put it on the line.
But how tragic it was that my Australian friends would not share his video with their friends because they didn't want to look like they were endorsing Pete Evans. Are you kidding me?
Yep.
Are you kidding me? You don't want to share life-saving information because you think the guy had whatever your thoughts were. I don't care. What he was trying to do was trying to help people. And it was sad to see that. And that's got to change.
Exactly.
It absolutely does. We've gone past the hour mark already, and I don't want to let you go. Dave, can we hang on to you for a bit longer?
Hey, you bet.
Okay, let's. I think for the sake of production and other issues, we need to break the interview into two parts. So I'd like to thank you, Dave Martin, for participating in this wonderful interview. We've got a stack more questions we want to ask. I'm really enjoying the honesty. John, what about you?
Mate, it's very refreshing, and I think everyone will be out there absolutely loving what David's got to say.
Okay, so we want to thank you all for watching this. It doesn't work unless you share it. And we'll see you again tomorrow night for part 2 of this outstanding interview with Dr. David Martin. Bye for now.
Perfect.